Hi, I'm Andy Tate. I'm really pleased to be here today with my colleagues, friends, collaborators for our inaugural Comics Day. Today we're going to be getting together to reflect on comics and graphic novels, word and image, that wider family of media, really as a way of kind of launching a research and teaching venture that's been ongoing within our department and the school that we're going to be part of very soon. As a real enthusiasm. We have practitioners, we have people who are committed kind of theorists, all of us are enthusiastic readers. We're members of staff, we're students, and we're thinking really about what the university can do in the future in its relationship with comics. There are really exciting things happening in our library, for example, where the comics and graphic novel collection is being consolidated, being brought together. And that's going to be happening, I think, in the coming months. My colleague Ines will be able to say more about that later during her workshop. We've got a really exciting day today. It's my real pleasure to introduce my colleague Kwasu Tembo, who's going to be speaking about Superman. Kwasu, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. It's a very lovely introduction. I'm so glad to be a part of this. Very many reasons. Been a lifelong comic reader myself. And an ardent defender of the form as a legitimate area or area of content and endeavor of academic study and beyond. And I've reworked the following into what I'm now thinking of as a kind of creative critical piece that's taken on a variety of different versions. The title of which is The People of Earth versus Kal-El of Krypton, Closing Arguments in Defense of a Superhero. Now, I could, in perhaps a bad impression of a late career Lacan who simply walked into conferences and drew math themes in silence and left, leave this pictogram, this neon hieroglyph, as a complete explication of the character, my client. But a hieroglyph is not a defense, and so ab initio, it's worth remarking by way of an introduction that emphasizes brevity, how remarkably reductive the court of public opinion. But when it comes to my client, and this is part of the difficulty, even the reductive is remarkable. For instance, it's remarkable that we all know his origin story. Ahead of the cataclysmic explosion of the alien planet Krypton, its foremost scientist Jor-El and his wife Lara Lorvan placed their infant son Kal-El in an escape shuttlecraft. Narrowly escaping his parents' fate, Kal-El is sent hurtling into space and subsequently crash lands in the wheat fields of Kansas on a planet orbiting a yellow star called Earth. The infant is taken in as a foundling by the Kents, a childless, loving human couple. He grows, he loves, fails, flies, seeks, tries, dies, resurrects, tries again and again and again. Let us not be deceived. Superman, as a Kryptonian, is an alien life form sharing uncanny physical and behavioral similarities with human beings. While he is genetically Kryptonian, the traumatic destruction of his homeworld cut him off from Kryptonian culture, language, art, history, ideology, and lifestyle in any kind of lived or communal sense. In this way, Superman is more Kryptonian by definition than by experience, in that his entire experience of what an Earthling might call youth, adolescence, and adulthood is circumscribed by human ideology. While Superman may not be human in an ontological sense, he certainly lives, behaves, and thinks like a man, a white man, an American no less, in an existential sense. Now, the influence of human ideology on the character forms the bedrock of the various impetuses, moral, legal, and social, that govern both his behavior and, more problematically, his power. The central tension here is that the Superman mythos centers on the narrative of a character that looks like a human being but can act in ways humans deem godly. A figure whose very existence within the DC Comics orrery of worlds that reproduce facsimiles of extra-diegetic Earth mark his very existence as an existential crisis for we humans. One whose embodied power and otherness cannot but always already be political. One who intercedes in human affairs in what is often assumed and accepted to be altruistic ways, guided primarily by the often ill-defined and bankrupt ideas of truth and justice. It is this confluence of the onto-existential mixture of being and experience that makes Superman a particularly interesting, complex, and helpful metaphor in discussions of the issues and debates concerning power, identity, and otherness, and all the domains they subtend, contended and fraught as they are. And so this is my client, And contrary to the present edifice, this is a court, the contours of which are clear. The defendant, Kal-El, the charge, the impossibility of his goodness, or as Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor says, Superman cannot be all good if he's all powerful, and he cannot be all powerful if he's all good. The prosecution's star witness, obviously, Bruce Wayne, the Bat of Gotham, the Dark Knight. The people of Earth versus Kal-El of Krypton. Now, in seeking to prosecute a defense of this asylum seeker, this refugee, this immigrant, this orphan, this survivor, this everyday laborer, this simulacrum of an average Kansan, this superhero, this man of tomorrow, one might easily retort and say to do so would be to prosecute the defense of a mendicant, an Auslander, a liar, a cheat, a performance, a pastiche of our potential, a potent usurper of our dream of flying, a thief of our air, our fear, our love. How dare I? To do so is anti-human, treason, in fact, against this our type and all its try and too tall heap of fail. I'd welcome the rebuke, but I'd remind whoever leveled it that even stars die. Everything that can experience its own being will lose, and it is not that loss and all its levels of shock and scale, one or many losses, singular or unending losses, the fall of a guillotine or 1,000 little cuts, an atom bomb or a hammer blow, that characterizes what was and is now gone, but how those left respond to that loss and that of others. It is this that will define you. It is what defines this being with many failings who never stops trying to help. Never. Undoubtedly often crude, indubitably often naive, but equally undeniably always unceasing. And in our golden age of feeling nothing, it may be all but impossible to really appreciate what that means. The case, if we could call it that, is always the same. Who's better, Batman or Superman? I say a ruefully case in inverted commas because the terms of the comparison are never quite fair. To say, as 9 out of 10 people often and still do in my experience, that this is an easy answer, Batman obviously, is to begin and end the terms of the comparison on the fallacious footing of an asymmetric assaying. Likewise, the charge, you'll hear, is always the same, often approximating something like Zack Snyder and David S. Goya's Man of Steel, where Jor-El and Lara have the following exchange in which both parents acknowledge the difficulty their child will face as being both a part and a part of and from the dominant and minority groups on Earth relative to a Kryptonian. Lara says he'll be an outcast, they'll kill him, to which Jor-El responds, how? He'll be a god to them. This dialectical position expressed by Superman's sires and forebears in some strands of the mythos his engineers can be firmly grounded in a numinous, albeit potent and persistent discomfort, like the horror vacui of a burst planet, dwelling with an extruding gravity of a being who, compared with even the best humanity could put in the field, for example, someone like Bruce Wayne, a triumph of the human will, a paragon of the human intellect, always enjoys the privilege of an unfair advantage. The evidence you'll hear is always some version of, well, Batman is more psycho-emotionally complex, that his tension of dual identities makes for an interesting study of wealth, crime, poverty, and privilege, the relatable, tragic excesses of grief and loss, the history of cities, their fables, myths, and urban legends. The Gothic is there too, of course, with all its trans-noir chic and its prurient interest in discipline and punish, in straps and scars. So too is the camp, in the Penny Dreadful and in the Magistrate's Chronicle, from Sweet James McClane, Dorian Gray, to the Scarlet Pimpernel and Spring-Heeled Jack, right the way through to the psychosexuality of the leather, the disguise, the cape, the plague doctor of a mad city, as Pattinson insightfully described the character, the bat and the cat, Gotham, its rogues gallery, its gargoyles and deco, its red sky, black shadow with white eyes. How human. And through his strife and struggle and futile long nights, how we find our pedigree of resistance. How can anything compete or compare with something so unassailably cool? How can a big blue Boy Scout, an assumed paragon of not only American jingoism, but conservatism, of the values of the heartland, of God, of the Old Testament and the Talmud alike, an unsophisticated country boy in an unrealistic city, a sanitized tableau of chrome and glass, and the sun glinting off the stately pates of gold-plated American bald eagles, the stars and stripes billowing behind. How could such possibly compare which is really code for the question, how can he be interesting? The journalist, the lackey of the ideological state apparatus and its media arm, the superhero, the repressive arm of the state, an alien apparatus of power, hands that can crush coal into diamonds, eyes of pure fire, the weaknesses of human beings and their societies clear to him as a broken bone under X-ray, a beacon of hope, a tyrant lying in wait, a naive fool, an enforcer of something it's outside of, truth, justice, the American way, a cheat perhaps, a liar, a narcissist. He needs the crime, the despair, the dangerous interactions of human beings in which, at state level and globally, he intervenes in order to feel special, an alien amongst us, but he is not like us. No matter how good the performativity of his passing, he's watching us. Even now, he can hear the blood in our veins. He's stronger than us. What are we to him? Wait, isn't it to it? Pets? A trifle? A distraction from his terrible solitude? What does he need us in our suffering for? To not feel alone? To have purpose? How often these questions, legitimate as they may be, obfuscate another far harder. What do we need him for? As part of the publicity campaign for James Gunn's Superman, Gunn asked several noted comics authors to speak about their favorite Superman comics. Among them was Mark Waid, the man said to know everything about Superman, from his favorite meal, which was beef bourguignon, his social security number, 092-09-6616. His encyclopedic knowledge about the character would, on any charge and before any jury, qualify him as a star witness for the defense, and so we call him. Proven indeed, I think, by his response to Gunn's prompt, Superman, number 148, October 1961. In the story titled Superman Owes $1 Billion, IRS agent Rupert Brand goes through records and is shocked that Superman has never paid his taxes nor reported all the reward money and net assets he's earned over the years. He becomes determined to collect the taxes owing from the Man of Steel. He tells Superman that he needs to pay back his taxes, taking him back to the IRS building, where he shows and calculates how much Superman owes and tells the Man of Steel that he needs to pay the IRS $1 billion within the next 24 hours, otherwise he will order the FBI to come and arrest him. Wanting to abide by the law, as Superman does, he rushes out to try and collect the money that he owes as quickly as possible, a task that proves to be harder than it would seem. He flies to the African Congo, where he collects a large cache of elephant tusks from an elephant graveyard, hoping to net the $1 billion from selling the ivory. He tries to compress coal into diamonds. He tries to find gigantic pearls to pay his debt to the human race and its systems of power. With no options left and his deadline looming, Superman writes a check for $1 billion to give to Brand. Brand tells Superman that the check is worthless, as it is coming from the First National Bank of Krypton, a bank which no longer exists. However, at the last moment, Brand's boss enters and tells Brand that Superman doesn't owe any tax due to Code 1426B of the Income Tax Code, which states that a taxpayer can deduct $600 from their income from each dependent they pay for. Rationalizing that Superman's dependents are the entire world, he has no taxable income. With Superman's tax woes sorted out, Brand and Superman shake hands and part company. As a good star witness does, Wade calls to attention a vital piece of evidence of the defense. One in which is embedded, I think, the essence of the disquietude the character induces in so many of the readerships, in many epochs of the form and genre of superhero comics more broadly. And that disquietude redounds to the fact that the debt, it seems, is ours. Lex is not unique here. Many of us are sick with and of our dependency, and all of us, to some degree, are sick with and of our own independence and its latent responsibility, the responsibility to act. To call one last star witness for the defense would lead me to direct your attention to April 18th, 2025, Superman Day, when the Glaswegian image text mage Grant Morrison was a guest on the Comic Books Couples Counseling podcast. He put it sharp and clear, as he often does, his instinct to cleave closely to the heart of the concept near unparalleled. He said, and I quote, "A lot of people apply this concept of hope to Superman, and while I appreciate it, I get this in the almost Christ-like messianic sense that Superman can sometimes have, I think that's the wrong approach. To me, Superman doesn't sum up hope. Superman's key word is action. He didn't appear in Hope Comics, he appeared in Action Comics. And Superman is not someone who just floats in space, ethereal, escape flying, and suggests some place we could eventually reach. Superman says, no, do it now. Action. Superman moves through the world and gets shit done. And I think that's way more important than the notion of Superman as a messianic or Christ-like or even quasi-religious figure. Superman gets in there and he gets shit done and he protects the vulnerable, and that's what it's all about. If you're weak and in trouble or someone is coming to mess you, Superman steps in and punches the guy out. He's not Christ. He doesn't tell you to turn the other cheek. He punches out bullies. And we have to remember that that's the essential quality of the character, I think. End quote. The essential quality of action. This streak of red, blue, and gold cracking open the sky at near light speed. This purple comet crash landing into the pre- and post-atomic zeitgeist, extending the possibilities of flight from never to maybe. And so, in answer to the standing charges, does this necessarily condemn the character to relegations of the unbelievable? What will Superman perhaps be to us and we to him? And so to conclude, I do two things. I say one thing and I show another. The thing to say is that the thing that makes Superman so unbelievable to so many is the thing we wished we most believed. That a man can fly, that without fail and not without error, the best of us will never be enough to bring about a lasting peace on earth. Maybe that's part of it. But I think the core of it is more simple and more severe. That without fail and not without error, what makes Superman the best of us is that despite all his strengths and weaknesses, one thing never changes. He always tries. To dismiss Superman as less than Batman or any other comic book character for that matter is to disregard a whole lot. Two teenagers in New York's East Side, penniless, physically unimpressive, myopic, persecuted on account of being Jewish, chased through the streets to a home without heat and barely any light or food, rocked to sleep with tales of Samson and Atlas, Elijah, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, John Carter of Mars, whispers overhead in their parents' room of a place called Lithuania, the word empire, the word survivor, Cleveland, Ohio, Jerry and Joe, Siegel and Schuster, Glenville High, fanzines, fitting in. It would be to dismiss everything that Superman lost and everything he gained, and what we gained when he crash-landed into popular culture on the powerful, resonant, ambiguous cover of Action Comics #1, June 1938. One of the most successful feats of world-building in the history of modern global popular culture. Yes, Japan gave us Astro Boy and Ogun Bat. Belgium gave us Tintin. Yes, France gave us Nyctalope. But it was America that gave us Superman. America gave us a way of thinking of strange visitors, of our own intergalactic fragility, our own potential. Instead of viewing Superman's mixedness, this ontological and auto-existential sense of strangeness, as an invariably tragic subject position marred or marked by melancholy and a tragic sense of cultural and identitarian displacement and isolation, I contend that the more concerted and explicit explorations of the cultural and individual perspective, wisdom and freedom of such an experience need to be brought to the fore. In so doing, in celebrating as opposed to condemning the character for his otherness and power, Superman can become far more than an indirect icon of neoconservative white supremacy, of men who fancy themselves steel or masters of the past, the present, or the future, of the state's never-ending battle for control, of the boss, the gestalt, and the increasingly impossible commons of tomorrow. Instead, we could see ourselves in the sun in Superman's eyes, that he and we alike are children of hope and loss, of survival and community, of history and opportunity, of the try of it all. That we, like he, are all children of the stars. And all the foregoing can be summarized in the thing to show, which the defense now submits as its only exhibit.
I, Jor-El, of the House El, your father. Lara, Lord Van, of the House Van, your mother. And every scholar, scientist, priest, librarian, general, judge, healer, planter, hero, villain, and bigot. Every cult, criminal, monster, machine. Every mountain, every plant, every beast of the air, water, and land, every continent, country, and city, every sword and skyship, citizen and god, jewel and bauble, every laugh, cry, prayer, every great work of word and song and dance, every rite and ritual, every sport and contest of skill or arms, every omen and superstition, every custom, courtesy and confection, every council, guild and group, all that mighty Krypton and her people have ever been, ever known, ever dreamed, our time is now ended. But you will live. You will travel far. All our hopes and dreams, they go with you, my little Kal-El. My God, Jonathan, a baby boy. Where did he come from? It doesn't matter. He's all alone. All alone. We will take him, and we will keep him, and we will call him Clark.
The defense now rests.
Kwasu, that was out of this world. Really, so good.
Thanks.
I know I have lots of things I want to ask you.
Yeah, sure.
Talk to you about. I'm sure people in the room do. So I'm going to throw it open.
Yeah, sure.
So, questions? Anything you would like to ask?
I was wondering, sorry, I came in late,
No,
so you
good.
may have covered this. I was curious what you think about Superman's relationship to government, and I ask because I was thinking of, you were talking about the original writers, and I was thinking about how his arch nemesis,
Yeah.
Lex Luthor,
Yeah.
is a CEO,
Yeah.
which is interesting, and then he becomes president, but also he becomes president often in the comics, Lex Luthor, but also Superman is often at the whim of the government, it seems.
Sure.
And stuff. So I was just curious.
Yeah, it's a perennial thorn, like it's Superman's boot. Obviously, Frank Miller in The Dark Knight really addresses, I think personally it's a reductive reading, but it's far easier to pit the bat against the Lost Sun if the sort of ideological cleave is clear, which is quite rich, no pun intended, coming from a guy who clearly needs therapy, has gone through a really traumatic experience and has all this kind of like nouveau riche bourgeois money and resources to draw upon.
Pretty bad person.
Yeah, to kind of redistribute that trauma in ways that are in and of themselves, I think, ethically, like, indefensible. But I do think Superman is such an interesting case insofar as like state power, state interventions, etc. By virtue of the fact that there was always this necessity to answer the question, what should he do? Like, it's not, in my doctoral thesis, I argue that even if he crash landed in Kansas and just decided to do nothing, like the fact of his otherness has already changed the world. The fact that he's something else, genuinely something else, however uncannily similar, requires some question of sort of action, the auspices and precepts thereof. And obviously if you sort of denude the state interventions or the state facing interventions that Superman is always enjoined to kind of participate in, to say where does he get his ideology, where does he get his morality from? And it's the Kents, but the Kents are still like, like Central Americana, quite conservative ultimately. I think the most interesting aspects of that tension between like right and wrong, what's legal and illegal, is really answered early on in the character's mythos. You just read the first 10 issues of Action Comics, and he goes after everybody. He goes after like bad kids, and he hangs them on like telephone wires. He goes after like corrupt taxi cab corporations. He goes after corrupt like mining tycoons. He goes after everybody with this really sort of naive, almost tantremic desire to do good. And it's quite heartbreaking in some sense by virtue of the fact that it's so ill-conceived in a lot of ways. And this is why Lois is so important, because she really does keep him in check. And she really does try to slow him down against this action that even in the panels in the first issue, in Action Comics #1, he's barely still. And how can somebody who's moving that quickly all the time really think about the consequences of their actions? So I think the state is, they always try to sort of co-opt that what ultimately redounds to an alien technology of power, tried to sort of force it into these ideological rubrics of America or this or that. But they're always, in so doing, it always shows them up to be so delimitating as like a human limit that he's so far beyond anyway. So that's some sort of an answer.
Yeah, so like just the fact that he is other and from somewhere out, like he instinctively is fighting those institutions.
Correct.
But
they're just insufficient in terms of describing him either fully or even, I'd argue more strongly, meaningfully. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. It's a hard one, but
it's all right.
Yeah.
So, really interesting ideas then, and thanks for that brilliant question, which kind of helped me think through some of the issues I was thinking about really towards the end of your paper when you were talking about the otherness of Kal-El. And I think this is bound up with a really complex racial history and religious history as well. Think about the Messianic, think about the inception at the end of the 30s, and the kind of the rise of Hitler, fascism, the fact that you've got these Jewish writers and creators bringing them into the world. That Superman, although in some ways coded as very white, actually is much more complex, isn't he? In that way. I don't think that he's white in the same way that his earthly parents are.
Sure.
In that kind of Midwestern
well said.
sense. And I do think there's a reading that is provided not just by that kind of biographical detail of Siegel and Schuster, but also the narrative that you're telling in the comics. He is consistently othered. And I do think it tracks a kind of history of anti-Semitism.
I think it does, for sure. Racial mixedness as well.
Yes.
Which I think became a lot clearer a lot later, specifically in and around the Civil Rights Movement, which is interesting because of the sort of big three in DC. It's so interesting how each of them really are inside or outside.
Yes.
Bruce is inside, but he's so outside.
Yes. Yeah.
Diana doesn't care. Diana's Themyscira, she's got so much more classical problems to contend with. These kind of pantheonic issues. And Superman is the kind of angel in Revelation with a foot on water and a foot on land. He's kind of kind of in both regimes, and it's very troubling. Diana, it's so interesting. There's I think his name is Kyle Sewell. There's after the New 52 reboot, one of hundreds of them, where Diana and Clark actually become an item, a romantic couple. And there's a suggestively sort of post-coital scene where they're having a conversation, and you could I love the way it's illustrated because Diana's so bored of Superman's inner conflict. To be you can fly, dude. You should just be so happy and joyous, and the service that you render to the humans is fulfilling for you. You're too hung up on elements that you cannot control. And in this sense, Diana has this sort of pragmatic realism that comes with power, comes with responsibility and so on. But I think when you track that sort of history of otherness, it's pulling from so many interesting figures, from Gilgamesh to Samson, Elijah, and then all these interesting sort of intermedial cleaves, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon were a huge influence. And that's really predicated on this John Carter from Mars template. An Earthling going to another planet and then gaining power. But the otherness is necessary in order for that power to inhere, let alone for the tensions that it reduces. So that's the sort of cost of your freedom in some sense, that you leave behind the toxic homeland, which at least for Superman is literally poisonous. Bits and pieces of kryptonite literally poison him. And then the radical sort of Hegelian openness of the future becomes a problem. What do you do now? What do you do now in face of the fact that you can do anything? It's so much more psychologically complex than I think people allow for. And this issue of otherness, it wasn't unfortunately, people like what's his name, Weisinger, when he was editor of DC in the 60s, 70s, or early 80s, there was a missed opportunity to really address this head on. They don't know what to do with the characters, so you have Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane doing way more interesting things, turning into a werewolf or the Eiffel Tower or a giant turtle, true story, or a merman. Superman just kind of was a sort of weird figure in this kind of domestic comedy, and that otherness was, I think, limited to sort of maybe even a sort of androcentric idea of sort of having a like a nuclear bomb washing the dishes isn't that interesting and funny. Like, I think it was a missed opportunity. They took up those racial problems or issues and debates with Green Arrow and Green Lantern, like, and they did some radical things, not so successful things, but it was displaced from Superman. And when they tried to really bring in these kind of like racial and ethnic issues and debates, they did like the worst job ever. I'm referring to I Am Curious Black, an issue where Lois Lane is turned black for 24 hours, and she's like, "Do you still love me, Superman?" And he's like, I don't know." And that's more or less the extent of that conversation. So it's an editorial lapse, I think, more than the sort of like character lapse, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the more recent iterations on television
Yeah.
that have been kind of quite successful, I think,
Yeah.
in storytelling terms, have lent into the domesticated Superman.
Correct.
Even though there's a kind of conspiracy thriller, he still does Superman
Correct.
stuff all the time.
Yeah.
You know, the most recent TV series about him really being a dad.
But being a father,
and,
yeah.
And, you know, they're very, very domestic issues as well as kind of these weird global, and of course
Correct, yeah.
it goes on the mythos of the comics quite nicely.
Yeah.
With a half brother and those
Yeah.
kind of things. But I do think it thinks about the fragility of humanness.
Yeah.
That's something else that you were talking about, wasn't it, earlier?
Yeah.
That actually it's using him as an allegory to think about our own position.
Correct.
It's
Yeah.
more interested in us than the gods.
I
even though it
completely
uses-
agree.
Yeah.
As an interface in that way.
Yeah.
And I think the most cynical, but also, so the idea, I mean, when it comes to a lot of these characters, I think there's like a central trio when you're discussing power, otherness, and identity. It's either it's going to be Superman, it's going to be Dr. Manhattan, or it's either going to be Miracle Man. It's
Yes.
one of those
Yeah,
three.
yeah,
like if
yeah,
you put the sliders on full of any sort of issue or debate, if you put it on max, those are the three answers that you get.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see how with Superman, like Mark Miller released Superman Red Sun, which kind of reverses certain sort of key predicates of the mythos to say, what if he crash lands in Soviet Russia?
Yeah.
And what happens ultimately, he becomes this tyrant. Like there are these fantastic sort of Big Brother 1984 inflected posters of him like literally like seeing through the whole world.
Yes.
And Lex, no spoilers, he writes a letter to him. And Lex is about to lose, and he's like, well, why don't you just put the world in a bottle, kind of needling him in the side to be like, yeah, I mean, you level such stringent rebukes against somebody like Brainiac who put cities in bottles, Candors in a bottle, like, and you hated this idea of trapping like beings and not letting them be free, but you're doing exactly the same thing. So I think that's the most radical inflection of this idea of being judged or critiqued in some way, let alone sort of this panoptic, superpowered control over like the future even of humanity, which as far as a critique, and I brought this up in my dissertation in a chapter called Why Superman Can't Save the World. It was followed by Why Superman Can Save the World, to really like test these ideas. Is the Lex Luthor like conundrum? Lex had like the best argument that Lex has against Superman is like how do you know that you're not denaturing us? Like how do you know that even if you do leverage our own precepts and our own metrics of measure, that you're not somehow changing or destabilizing or denaturing like our future? Like you just being here, let alone flying around in a costume and like lifting up like buildings and stuff, like you've changed things. In the same way that Joker says to Bruce, like, no, it's different now. Crime doesn't mean what it used to mean. Like now it's permanently altered. And I think that's a very salient and problematic, like philosophical, economic, cultural, ecological to some degree or other problem. Like what goodies do you have in these crystals, these sunstones? Like you could solve, cure, protect so many things in such a decisive way, then you get a Dr. Manhattan or Miracle Man situation. But Superman doesn't want to be like, he doesn't want to be a god. He just wants to be a dude, like who is loved, who is protected in some sense from his own loneliness. Like, and I think, I hate to say it, I think it's that dependence and need on humanity for some of these things that he can't get from anywhere else, quite literally, because there's no availability of anything that resembles him, is what keeps him from saving the world.
Yeah.
It's a tragic dilemma, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's you sort of said it a bit, but there's a quote I came across which I always loved, which is Batman is a man who's trying to be a god, and Superman is a god who's trying to be a man. Human. Yeah.
There was a religious idea of kenosis, of self-emptying.
For sure.
And it's, I mean, I think you can run into trouble quite quickly in a way, but it's it reminds me of a whole sequence in the Scorsese adaptation of The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, does anybody know that movie?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I know it.
Yeah. So it's based on Miss Kazanka's novel. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. And it was quite unfairly maligned.
Very controversial at the time.
You know, typically by the religious right, even though
Yeah.
it's a profoundly religious novel.
It is.
And it's when he just considers, you know, what if Jesus had decided to kind of cast off his divinity,
Yeah.
in one sense, at the end of his life, and live a normal life.
Yeah.
That's the temptation, is to live in his fully human way. And he has that vision on the cross.
Yeah.
If he'd lived a life with,
Yeah.
with Mary, and you know, there are kind of problematic ideas in terms of what it does with the Mary figure. There's lots of situations do, but it is very similar in a way.
Yeah.
That what Clarke chooses in lots of these spin-off interpretations and adaptations is the human life, but he does get to have it both ways.
He does.
And
And in getting it both ways, he gets neither fully.
that there are compromises.
That's the cost, yeah. And it's, even if he wanted to say, just like, look, I'm just going to be a journalist. I'm just gonna eat my beef bouillon. I'm just gonna pay my rent, my taxes, so I don't get strung up by the IRS and so on. Lois wouldn't let him. This is why I drew this. In my opinion, if I was to sort of like lacon it and do like a math theme of the entire mythos, that's it. That's kind of all you need to know about the character. And if you cancel one out, then other things kind of like intercede and buttress and so on. But even if he wanted to abdicate this idea of being a protector of humankind, Lois wouldn't let him. To be like, and this is why I'm really looking forward to the James Gunn adaptation, because what I've seen in the promotional materials and this is shouts out to Rachel Brosnahan. She has this really believable Margot Kidder inflected kind of truculence when it comes to Lois. In so many ways, they're such perfect foils for one another, because Lois oftentimes just doesn't think a lot. Like, she just rushes into the danger and tries to help, or at least give an account, a testimony of what happened. And she often rebukes Superman for doing exactly the same thing. But at the same time, she's so keenly aware of this figure that has, you know, agencies that she doesn't, and like does well to remind him that it's his responsibility and duty, at least to account for them, and if more than that, to deploy them in a way that's like as least harm-inducing as possible. And she just wouldn't let him off the hook, and he acquiesces to her. This is why in things like there's a video game, Midway. Oh gosh. It's basically like a DC fighting game. I forget. The name escapes me right now. Injustice. Thank you. But one of the central premise of that game is that while Joker kills Lois Lane, a pregnant Lois Lane, I might add, and then Superman loses it. Like, if you rub out like Lois, then this whole thing just like explodes, and vice versa in a variety of other ways. If you remove Clark, Kal, and Superman don't quite cohere in the same way. Like, a lot of these arrangements are triadic. You know, triangles are the number 3 is a fantastically unstable number. Like, 2 of the other vertices keep the other honest, and vice versa. So at least for me, like, what this often redounds to, I just hate it when people say Superman is just boring. Like, that's so far from accurate. Like, to do so, as I say, is to exclude pretty much everything, which doesn't seem accurate, let alone fair.
Absolutely. Do you have more questions? Anything else? Yes?
Yeah, thank you so much. The more I listen to you talking about Superman, the more I like it. Even though it used to be a superhero that I just had no interest in.
I know.
And then I met you, and I'm like, oh my god, of course, he's so interesting. And something that I love that you said, and I think it's so relevant right now, so I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
Sure.
Is, you know, let's start thinking about Superman in different ways. And you were talking, you know, about how he is kind of like a child/icon of loss and hope.
Yeah.
And I think how powerful it is to hold these two things together.
Yeah.
The loss.
Yeah.
And the hope.
Yeah.
So I don't know, do you envision any ways in which they could write about Superman considering these much more interesting ways?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of really good examples. I think it's really interesting when it comes to sort of Superman's origin story. People try to rush through it because it's so common. Like, we all know it.
Yeah.
We all know it as much as anybody knows the story of Moses. Pretty much the same story.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, weirdly enough, Bryan Singer's Superman Returns, there's a deleted scene. I hate the fact that they deleted it, where Superman is like, I think Pa Kent has just died. It's like, Ma Kent, I need to like figure out like who I am. I've got these kind of like artifacts from Krypton. I got the ship that I came in. I got this material. And I got some crystals that have explanations and information. But like, maybe I need to go back and see it. And he builds this weird crystal spaceship and flies back to sort of the remnants of Krypton. And I think that's the way in which Singer frames it is. That's where he really learns that kryptonite is toxic. Like, because he's kind of in, orbiting what's just like a field of debris, and starts to feel ill. But it's shot in like this beautiful wide angle, and you really get a sense of the scale of that loss. And that's why, like, the exhibit that I submit, that's my goal, to basically show, like, when people think of Superman, they think of a guy flying around with a smile on his face, saving cats or like whatever, fighting things. And like, the loss is so profound, like the loss of a whole planet, like a whole history. That's something that makes his solitude so terrible. Like, and based on that, I can. It's equally as relatable to me to be like, being loved and included and supported is more valuable than me saving the world. Like, I can understand somebody making that exchange. Like, when you consider the profundity of the loss, and I think it's just fair to consider that they've all lost something. Less so Diana, but in a way, yeah, sure. But like, this is why Bruce and I think Clark really understand each other. Like, sure, you can sort of like, crystallize, no pun, etc., that loss into the loss of a parent or parents for Bruce. His whole world in that sense disappeared. But I think there's something very direct and cataclysmic and eschatonic, this religiosity, this, revelations-y quality to sort of like the end of Krypton, which, to Snyder's credit, the best part of Man of Steel is the first 30 minutes, where you see all the stuff going on in Krypton, like this desiccated, bone-like, emaciated, like profligate culture that thought it was immortal, that thought it could just basically continue as it's such a perfect reflection of our own hubris. And the result of that loss would lead us to leave this kind of like tragicomic experience that Superman has, but without the power. So I think that, and I don't like to hop on loss, because I mean, as a sort of like international person myself, going from place to place, there've been many times where I've lost the world. Like a group of friends, a milieu, a sort of way of life, a language, and so on. Even just like the similitude of seeing other brown people, like these things have disappeared from my life. And they always engender me, and maybe that's just me, to sort of like really try and appreciate what it is that I have wherever I am, where I am. And I think Superman does try to do that. And I can relate to that, and I can accept that there is this tension between the necessity to act responsibly, like for your host people, as it were, your host nation, but at the same time to not be undone by your loss. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing.
Well, wise words for the present time.
That's exactly. I've said this to you before, and it's like, I think, and there's a photo. I found a photograph of me as like on my third birthday. I was 3 years old, wearing like a Superman shirt, and I just didn't. I'd asked myself, like, how old is this like appreciation of the character? Because to me, it feels quite recent. Just hearing people talk incessantly about Batman, I was like, who's talking about Superman? And I realized nobody was. I was like, I'll do it. Like, but it seems like it goes much further back. And this idea of like, whenever things are really like difficult and there's a constant sense of attrition and loss, like to just try harder, like just to do what you do and love what you love and enjoy what you enjoy all the more. Like, it's a Nietzschean idea, and I think when like a lot of people compare Nietzsche to Superman, they think of the Ubermensch, but it's far out of this idea. The most important thing I think that Nietzsche ever said was that, and I quote, human existence can only be redeemed as an aesthetic phenomenon, meaning that the only way that your life means anything is if you treat it like a work of art. You make it and you remake it, you destroy it, you rebuild it. I can't see a better example of a guy who has this weird costume, like this weird constant performance art piece that undoes and redoes his existence all the time. I think that's the most Nietzschean aspect of the character, far more than his power. People get hung up on the power. People like Snyder just like make him blow stuff up. I'm like, that's such a limited view.
Yeah, and it's always in service of others, historically.
For sure.
I came in to see Superman aged 8 on the big screen.
Sure.
The Christopher Reeve version. I remember it so vividly.
Yeah.
Even though it's a kind of imagined.
Yeah.
I've directed and edited the memory.
Yeah.
I remember who I was with exactly. I remember a friend who's exactly 2 years old, same birthday, 2 years older than me, and he was like pulling rank during it. And I remember us getting a bollocking from both our parents while we were there. I remember which adverts were on. There was an advert for Apocalypse Now. And we were like 8, and he was 10. But I remember just how foundational that film was, and that version. But it was, the Christopher Reeve version was very much that he would always sacrifice himself.
He quite literally in that film, he lets a train run over him. Like he lays. It's not that he, in the same rebuke that like Captain America levels to Iron Man in the first Avengers, to say like, a hero's a guy who like lays on the line and lets the little guy crawl over him. And then Tony Stark's like, I've just cut the wire. The snappy retort. In that film, it's so great because Superman is not just, he becomes the train track, like, because he can withstand it and he does it. Like, it's kind of nothing to him. And I think one of my favorite moments in maybe even any Superman media in its entirety that I've consumed is in Superman 2, where there's this question of do you become just a regular guy? And he does. It's wild. But there's a moment where he's in the Fortress of Solitude and Lois is there. And there, again, there's this sort of suggested post-coital scene or whatever. And then Superman is like, I've decided now, I'm just going to be a guy. And then he goes to this sort of like AI Jor-El. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to abdicate my power. Like, I'm just going to live as a regular dude. And then Jor-El, this facsimile of Jor-El is like really grilling him. Like, he's kind of cross-examining him to be like, do you know what the consequences of this will be? Like, why are you doing this? Is it worthwhile? And then Superman doesn't know this is happening. Like, there's a shot that cuts over to Lois, and she's just like in this weird ice cave wearing a Superman shirt, like in her underpants and like socks. And it's just such a beautifully like human moment. She's curious, but she's terrified. And I think it's such a perfect distillation of like not only their relationship, but I think the interface of like this radically powerful otherness and this ostensibly like curious and potentially vulnerable, but powerful in its own way, humanity meeting. As an example of first contact literature and or media, I think Superman is such a powerful and resonant example. Our next speaker is Fintan Chan, a student with whom I've had a standing collaboration and lots of discourses regarding the form, some of the characters involved, particularly Moon Knight and the Incredible Hulk. We've discussed a variety of different questions attending identity, multiple identities, and how it is that the form can precipitate representations of these issues and debates in really interesting and quite transgressive and far-reaching ways. So it's a pleasure to introduce Finn.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming and letting me do this. I'm going to be talking about how comics can represent complex psychological and internal experiences, focusing on Marvel's Moon Knight as a case study. This is adapted in part from my undergrad dissertation, looking at how the character's dissociative identity disorder is represented in comics. DID is a trauma disorder, sometimes known as its previous defunct name, multiple personality disorder. So to give a very simplified overview, it's the result of the self splitting into multiple distinct parts or alters in order to function in the face of overwhelming trauma. So if one part can't cope with something, another can take over and they can hold that memory so that the other part remains unaware and functional. In the case of Moon Knight, the system of alters is 3 main parts: Mark, Stephen, and Jake. Mark is the focal character in most runs and usually the one acting as the superhero in Moon Knight, but not exclusively. They're associated with the Egyptian god Khonshu, the god of the moon. In some runs, he's the source of their supernatural powers. In other runs, he's also implied to be an alter within the dissociative system. DID is a complex dissociative disorder, and one of the most controversial when it comes to media representation. I'm not looking to define or diagnose anything, nor am I qualified to do so, but many iterations of Moon Knight from 1975 to present have engaged with DID and complex psychology in a range of really diverse, creative ways. I want to focus in particular on what comics as a medium are uniquely capable of doing, using things like layout, visual style, and the interaction of text and image to represent and communicate experiences that might be considered unspeakable in other forms. Comics like these can take abstract nonverbal experiences like dissociation, trauma, and fragmentation and make them legible through form, being able to represent and simulate them in ways that other media often can't. By giving shape to emotional and psychological states, they're experienced visually, spatially, viscerally before they're interpreted or explained. That immediacy changes the relationship between the reader and the character, grounding it more in empathy and embodiment rather than the detached analysis. In Comics in the Language of Mental Illness, Sarah Thaler writes that readers and authors need to acknowledge that some experiences exist beyond the limits of words and require additional elements such as images in order to be fully conveyed. She suggested that the picto-verbal blend of the comic form isn't just a bonus but a necessity, that some things can't simply be described or explained, but they can be shown and subsequently felt. Comics' ability to dynamically combine text and image allow them to communicate in multiple modes, switching or balancing between the two to take advantage of the mode most effective for their message. For experiences that might be described as unspeakable or indescribable, they can turn to image or augment words with illustration to communicate it anyway. In the 2017 Moon Knight run, the system's inner world is rendered as an inhabitable but still inherently abstract and unreal space. It's illustrated and described as a picturesque, violent landscape, reflecting the many facets and contradictions that make up Mark and the other authors. It's distinguished from the external world by its muted color palette, made to appear more dreamlike and intangible in comparison to the more saturated real world. A conflict between Mark and Jake is literalized as a fistfight that brings them through several distinct locations, but the flow of dialogue between them anchors the scene's continuity. The distinct locations, the sun transitions distance the scene from reality, but the symbolic settings ground it in the logic of the inner world and metaphorical headspace. The settings are, as Khonshu explains, fragments of their past touched by folklore and mythology that they're familiar with. The space is unstable, and to the characters who inhabit it, familiar and comprehensible. Mark throwing a punch that knocks him and Jake into a void of stained glass windows isn't significant enough for either of them to pause their argument, because physical impossibility is irrelevant to a space that functions according to emotional and psychological logic, implicitly legible, navigable, and understood by the characters it's responding to. Like any mind, it's formed of thoughts, memories, and emotions. It at first seems alien and chaotic because the amalgamation of influences is so unique to the individual or individuals that form it. The dialogue, the emotional through line of the scene keeps the sense and meaning clear. The images alone appear disjointed and incoherent, which to an outsider they essentially are. It's the collaboration of word and image that both enables and enhances the scene as legible and meaningful. With the knowledge that the space is formed from memory and experience, meaning is given to the symbols that otherwise appear random. The silhouette of a woman is recontextualized as Marlene, an ex-lover. The stained glass windows acquire a new meaning through the lens of the system's fraught relationship with religion. And the desert can be identified as the site where Mark was bound in the surface of Khonshu, with the chain visible in the background. Even completely silent, wordless images can be highly expressive, exemplified in covers and chapter cover art, responsible for both engaging and informing at a glance. Wordless panels and pages don't lack information, but rather provide a space for the unspoken. The cover art for the chapter Birth and Death, Part 1, is a flashback to Mark meeting Khonshu as a child, and it wordlessly explains their relationship before the narrative even begins. Khonshu is drawn in a different art style, black and white with rough, overlapping lines. He creates the sense of visual distortion and instability indicative of the ambiguity and uncertainty surrounding his character in this run. Whether or not he's an actual Egyptian god and alter in the dissociative system or a figment of Mark's imagination is unknown. He breaks the visual code or internal consistency of the comic. But whether it's because of his godly powers or if he's simply not real, there's no clarification. But whatever he is, he's obviously unnatural and uncanny. He looms over a young Mark who's literally kneeling in his shadow, and Khonshu stands on top of his chalk drawings, showing his disregard for childhood innocence and humanity. His head, a bird's skull, evokes death and decay, and his posture is imposing and predatory. The power dynamic between them is clear, as is Khonshu's dominance and Mark's comparative helplessness. And when Khonshu does speak, his dialogue uses a sharp, angular font in speech balloons in inverted colors, which is completely unique to his character. No one needs to exposit or explain that his voice is inhuman and uncanny. It's silently and instantly communicated through the typography and design. And the design isn't just aesthetic, it's affective. It doesn't just convey information, it shapes how the character and situation are emotionally experienced by the reader. Another defining trait of comics is their spatiality, because everything on the page forms part of the visual grammar that structures both time and consciousness. So panels are snapshots of perception, emotion, insight, communicated by the interplay of text and subtext. Because images are experienced visually and immediately, that immediacy means they're seen and felt before they're categorized, analyzed, or reasoned with. And that immediacy becomes empathy. In this way, the layout doesn't just neutrally contain the meaning, it constructs it by bringing order and imposing coherence. And when comics break their own implicit rules and internal consistencies by distorting the layout, disrupting the rhythm, or switching the visual style, readers don't just see the instability, they can feel it. In Moon Knight from the Dead, the form deteriorates over 2 pages, in parallel with Mark's emotional state. His therapist claims that he doesn't have DID but brain damage, and that his brain has been colonized by Khonshu. So his worldview and self-perception are shattered, and thus so is the formal consistency of the comic layout. The stable, realistic style background of the doctor's office darkens, overlaid with dark smudges and flecks, before being overcome and replaced entirely. The gutters lose their clarity, no longer able to separate the panels or anchor and distinguish meaning and coherence. As she continues talking, the structure of the page itself is decaying. The final page abandons reality altogether, reflecting the world as it's experienced rather than how it actually is. It becomes sensory and spatial, reflecting a pre-verbal instinctive emotional reaction, illustrating the feeling of falling and the sudden relocation into a world without structure and security. The world no longer makes sense to Mark, so the comic form, the reader's entry point into that world, loses its own accessibility and coherence. Comics demand a level of interaction from their readers through the physical page turn or the digital click, tap, or scroll, so the reader is made into a participant complicit in the continuation of the story, but they still don't have any agency in how things play out. They're engaged but not necessarily empowered or even informed. The first-time reader has no idea what the next page will reveal, and this small degree of autonomy can be twisted into a source of visceral dread and discomfort. In Jeff Lemire's 2016 run, these formal techniques are brought together in a chaotic series of pages in which Mark is pulled through the inner world or worlds of the system. Even the world which the readers have come to know as reality or assumed reality doesn't feel entirely trustworthy with its decentered, irregular panels. Then Mark steps through the door, the reader turns the page, and they're probably equally surprised to find themselves on the moon. The art style changes entirely. In an immediate and immersive shift that the comic doesn't pause to explain. It just demands that the reader immediately adjust, just as Mark has to the sudden destabilization of narrative expectation and spatial logic. Before anything can be processed or normalized, he's attacked and flees into another reality, in another art style and another type of instability. This one, a film set, first seems physically safe, but compels Mark and the reader to both question their perception of reality. But again, danger returns, and before anyone can relax, Mark is chased into another world. In this sequence, each page turn is weaponized for its ability to surprise and disorient, effectively simulating the experience of dissociative identity switching. There's no need to stop and explain the sudden, jarring sensation of being in a new, unfamiliar place with no clear idea of how you got there and having no choice but to adapt instantly. And doing so would disrupt the necessarily hectic pace and constant motion, which enables not just observing but experiencing the situation. Turning the page, processing and deciphering shifting styles and signs, and reconciling textual and visual information all require the reader to inhabit an investigative, creative mode of reading. Readers aren't just passive recipients of information, but called upon to personally navigate the ambiguity and fragmentation of the narrative. Fuller argues that there is a unique and critical understanding that comes from a visual and gestural reading, in which reading itself becomes an active, participatory, and interpretive process. Understanding is not delivered to the reader, but evoked through the physical and affective labor of engagement and interpretation. Throughout Moon Knight's comic runs, internal experiences and subjectivity aren't just represented, but constructed and simulated through the form itself. Layout, pacing, visual style, and design act as the grammar by which interiority is made legible and effectively powerful. Subjective states like dissociation and identity fragmentation aren't just explained but embodied in the formal structure of the comic itself. And that embodiment demands something of the reader, enlisting them as a collaborator in making sense and meaning. Meaning, understanding, and empathy emerge from the reader's own effort to reconcile text, image, and layout, especially when they might seem unstable or fragmented. The form's flexibility and hybridity allow access to and expression of things otherwise inaccessible, intangible, or unspeakable. Comics have the capacity to not only create stories about subjective experiences, but structures through which they can be more deeply personally encountered, interpreted, and at least partially understood. Thank you. That's my last slide. It had some cool covers, but...
You can bring it back up if you want.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Really, really great stuff, Fintan. So good. I'm sure there are lots of questions and ideas and thoughts. Does anybody have an opening question, however kind of specific or big or...
I have two.
Go ahead. Kwasu.
Maybe let's take them one at a time. I really love you keeping in frame, no pun, etc., like the actual materiality of the comic in and of itself, its formal characteristics, etc., its conventions, to then be contravened tactically in order to generate this sort of like immediacy, this immersion, and this empathy, which I think is a really interesting touch that you add to this. So I think of something like Grant Morrison's Animal Man, where he looks directly at the reader and kind of directly exhorts them and inculcates them in the story. Are there any Moon Knight comics in which the reader is directly addressed as if they were part of the system, like as if they were one of the alters in some way?
There's not any that I've read that like directly do that, but there is. It's in one of these runs actually. I'll see if it's in this one. I don't think I have a panel of it, but there's a confrontation between Mark, the whole system, and Khonshu, who in this run is kind of this abusive, like, paternal figure. So there's a confrontation, and like right at the end, where you see everything from the side, and then it kind of flips, so you're seeing like Khonshu through Khonshu's eyes as Mark. I think the exact line is, "We are Moon Knight and we never needed you." There's like this direct, he's like holding Khonshu's skull, and you're just framed through that angle. There's just this really interesting thing. Like, I think the whole run has some interesting stuff about kind of Khonshu can sort of be read as this kind of reader character. It's not like explicitly addressed, but it was just kind of one of my interpretations, where he's got this obsession with making Moon Knight like comprehensible into like this ideal superhero. Like he basically wants to wipe out the whole system and like use their body to be Moon Knight himself.
Right.
Because he's like, you aren't mentally stable.
Sure.
I think there is one of the pages like he's like, you are nothing, not anymore. Like you have to become. There's also a reading of Khonshu in this run as a member of the system.
Right.
Specifically, like as an introject, I had like a whole section in my dissertation that I don't have time to go into. But he's got this kind of persecutory introject role, which in like real life DID systems, like a persecutory alter is typically still acting in the system's best interest. They just have this warped perception of the way in which to do it.
Right.
So if you read Khonshu as like an alter in this run, he thinks like the ultimate duty of this body is to be this hero Moon Knight. You cannot do it because you're weak, so I will rule over the system with an iron fist to be this perfect figure.
That's fascinating. I really like the ontology of the reader in relation to this like system of which they're a part in the act of reading is fascinating. I think really drawn forward with a character like Moon Knight, who emphasizes systems, de rigueur. I've got a lot more questions about that, which we'll get into later. But the second question that I had is, I suppose, a question of interfacing of identities, right? Because Khonshu is a representation of like Coptic mythology, Egyptian, African mythology, and is more often than not inhabited by like a white guy. So are there any comics that kind of address that in relation to sort of like interacting identities within a sort of maybe a system that's held in tension with itself? Does that feature at all? I'm thinking recently because Christopher Priest released a comic book where it was T'Challa, Black Panther's son, is like a white dude, and people were like, "What?" So it's interesting to me to see like how these different identity categories of the mythoses upon which these characters are based and they're drawn from interact. I wonder if that happened in your reading of Moon Knight.
There's sort of like two directions that I kind of see that from. One of them, like it's Mark, or like the body systems, has a Jewish heritage, which is quite prominent in a lot of the runs, which I found like some of the comics address it like a lot more explicitly. There was one I was rereading the other day, actually. I wish I had panels. I'm trying to remember based on these ones. But basically, this guy is Mark's kind of uncle figure. So he grows up, his father is a rabbi. So he actually has a very kind of conflicted relationship with religion in general. Like, I think the most recent run is very explicit in like, he's like, my father was a rabbi, I'm a war criminal, my life is full of contradictions, like, I serve a god I hate, basically. But his trauma that is just supposedly causes the DID is generally carried through most runs is this guy who is an immortal Nazi posing as a Jewish rabbi.
Jeez.
Yeah. So he basically, Mark's father, the rabbi, is, I think, in Poland during the Holocaust, where he meets this guy who says his name is Rabbi Yitzpalman. His actual name is Ernst, but he basically betrays the family, but tricks them into like accepting him into their home and community. But he has a secret life, basically murdering Jews in the community, which Mark discovers. Like, he goes to meet him because he's having issues with his father, so he, like, Uncle Yitz is like his favorite person. So he goes to visit him, goes into the basement and finds him like torturing and murdering these people, which, long story very short, leads to the dissociation. and things like that. So like there's a lot of kind of discussion about like specifically Mark's Jewish identity as well as Jake's in the most recent run. But there's like an interesting thing where, because of the kind of fragmentation inherent to things like DID and dissociative plurality, a lot of traits are not equally shared between the systems.
Sure.
So a lot of Jake in the most recent run uses Hebrew and like engages more closely with the Jewish culture, presumably because of like the trauma inherent to that, like protecting the others from it, but still wanting to like honor and embody it. And the other thing in the other direction is a lot of there have been many Moon Knights through history.
Sure.
So Mark is the most recent one, as well as his brother Hunter's Moon, who's Egyptian, which is like an interesting thing. I think he's Muslim, but he like basically abandons the Muslim faith because he can't find meaning in it, and instead finds meaning through Khonshu. So you've kind of got this parallel between Mark kind of hating Khonshu for what he's done to him, and Hunter's Moon, the other Moon Knight, having this like devout dedication to him. But there have also been there was a couple of comics specifically have shown like historical Moon Knights, and it's been like very interesting. I think the most significant, I just thought of something else. The most significant is that there is a Black Moon Knight who I think operates in like New York, in the kind of street level community, but with like a very strong connection to the like local Black community, which she has an interaction with like the vampire hunter Blade, and there's like a whole like interesting dynamic there.
So yeah, thank you so much for being here. This is our last event of the day. My name is Ines. I teach creative writing here at Lancaster University, and I love comics, graphic novels. I am an illustrator myself, apart from being a writer. And this has been such a beautiful day for me because my interest in graphic novels is more with the indie, zine, kind of like graphic novel style, lots of different genres, but I am ashamed to say that superheroes were never quite my thing. However, I've been changed, I think, thanks to people like you, Kwasu. And I loved your presentation today as well, Finn, about Moon Knight. I've never read anything by this specific Marvel superhero, but like I'm gonna be researching so much after today. So it's been super interesting and transformative for me. And right now I'm bringing here one of my former students in the graphic novel module that we started running just this year at the university. At the beginning, Andy, you were saying how the university now is gonna expand on the graphic novel collection as well. So lots of really interesting things are happening in terms of comics. And it was thanks to this module and to the support of colleagues like you, Andy, that we, and the library as well, we managed to, to start a proper collection, because we didn't have a proper way of cataloging graphic novels. For those of you who have studied graphic novels know that it was a nightmare to go to the library, try to find them because they would be anywhere. They could be like, even the librarians couldn't find them. So now we'll have like shelves, and there'll be a proper section in the catalog just for graphic novels, and they're purchasing more as well, which is really, really good. So that's wonderful. So Antoni took the graphic novel course with me, but you have already written and published a graphic novel on your own by then, so you already, had all that practical experience. So I'm going to introduce Antoni very, very briefly. He's a final year film and creative writing student. Antoni is also the Polish ambassador for the European cinema at the Venice Film Festival, which is amazing. That's really great, Antoni. I didn't know that. And you just finished your undergraduate thesis on Polish cinema and moral anxiety. Wonderful stuff. You also did wonderful work with graphic novels as well. You were working on a project with alternative history, and mythology, and the figure of the hero. very interesting stuff. But today we have you here talking about your own graphic novel that you developed with an artist. And I think it's going to be so interesting to hear you talk from how you created this from the point of view of a writer, I suppose. Because I know here in the room there are people interested in writing for graphic novels who perhaps feel like, oh, but I'm not talented as an illustrator, I can't draw. And that doesn't have to stop you. You can still either just write for graphic novels or even develop your own illustration style. But yeah, do you want to introduce very briefly War Watchers, if you want, Antoni, and then I'll start asking you a couple of questions about your experience, and then we can open it for the room as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for this introduction. So yeah, I stopped sharing the screen because I wasn't able to see anybody anymore when I had the presentation before me. But yeah, I'll start it again now I'm not sure how much you guys will be able to see. This is a poster pitch that I had to present to some German politicians of all people. But it has all sort of information about this project in a nutshell. And I do want to give credit where it's due because it wasn't my independent project. It was part of a German network that I enrolled in my second year of study. And it was run by or sponsored by the German Federal Office. And it dealt with ethno-nationalism in Europe, the crisis of coexistence in Europe, also had some religious components to it, but effectively by the end we were supposed to create an anthology piece, and I, along with a partner who was the illustrator for this, we ended up preparing a graphic novel. Well, a graphic novel, it has 20 pages, so it's a graphic novella, maybe it would be a more appropriate way to call it. But to, I guess to explain very quickly the premise of it, it's we were the workshop that we enrolled in was mainly centered on war in Bosnia, and we were trying to find a way to visualize like our main formal objective, so to speak, was to create a story where war is pushed out of the frame, and our character focuses on the spectators, on people who are not directly impacted by war, but instead the process of their growing indifference and apathy, as we felt it related to war in Ukraine. So I'm originally Polish. This war is being waged right behind the border, and the illustrator, my partner, she's half Russian, so it was also a very familiar topic to her. And yeah, that in a few words was the general idea. But it's a fictional reality that we wanted to develop. So this is a map that it's one of the panels in the graphic novella, and this is the world we created for it. So it's meant to be fictional. It's meant to be very non-specific, but at the same time, it's supposed to feel European, so to speak. So that is a general introduction. But yeah, if you'll please do direct me in terms of what you'd like me to speak to specifically. But this is a brief introduction.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, sorry, can you still see the screen? I'm just standing here, so you can't see me. Thank you so much. Obviously, what you've produced is really impressive. And I think people can access this online. Am I right? They can actually read it online? Yes.
So the way it worked, we're preparing this anthology for this political event in Berlin. And originally, the anthology was distributed to all the attendees of that event, but later it was also made available online. So there is a PDF available on this network. It's called Dialogue Perspectives. And yeah, one can access it, download it, and it's freely available to everybody.
Yeah, just to say to everyone, if you are curious, we can share the link And then after this, you can go and read the whole thing, which is it's really, really interesting and really impressive. So I suppose my first question to you, as a writer myself, is because through knowing you as being part of my workshop, you've always said to me, you were very clear, you want to write 4 graphic novels, which, I love that you said that so much, and you always have a very strong interest for the medium. I think I met you first when you were in your second year, and already you were like, I want to write for graphic novels exclusively. So what do you think, what attracts you about this form? Because I know you also study film and you've written a script as well, but what is it about graphic novels that as a writer you find so interesting?
I think it's mainly to do with this being sort of a perfect 50-50 split between visual art and written art, and film being my second area of interest. It's graphic novels allows me to draw from that as well, and I do like to think in very visual terms, and most of my stories, pretty much everything I write, starts with specific images, and it was no different for this as well. And I'll move to the final slide because I think it illustrates it quite well. So the first image that this originated from was a town square with screens scattered around it. And as the war progresses, as it goes on, these screens begin to melt, to sort of sink into the ground. And originally, this was the only image we had, and then we started building other images around it. And graphic novel is just such a perfect medium for anybody who is very image and sequence driven, rather than story driven. So I think that is probably the key aspect.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely wonderful what you're talking about, because again, it's connecting to something we discussed already today. I have another student here, Finn, and Finn was talking all about the power of graphic novels and comics to express things that you cannot quite express by writing or by talking or maybe just with image, because it has this perfect combination of image and words. But it allows you to create things like what you are showing us here, that has there is an emotional impact on these images and a surrealism, and they're expressing a lot of internal landscapes or feelings as well in a really interesting way. That's wonderful. So I guess a second question that I would like to ask you, and this comes out a lot with the students when we are thinking of graphic novels, when they say, I would love to write comics, I would love to write a graphic novel, but I don't know how to draw, or I have no interest in drawing. And you found someone to collaborate with, someone who is obviously very talented to create these amazing drawings. So what was that creative relationship like? I mean, first wrote the script, and then the artist, she just drew what she wanted, or you had discussions all the time on how she was going to approach it? How did it work? Yeah.
Yeah, it was a long process. So when one does end up going into graphic novels, I guess it's probably quite essential that you work with somebody you can stand to spend a lot of time with, because it is a very collaborative process. And for us, it was I think there were 3 main stages we divided this in. So we started with this we approached it quite like one would approach a film or a screenplay, because we started with a Bible, with a big story Bible, which was like 30 pages long. And it had all sorts of character notes, details about images, citations, because this story is essentially a collage of different historical schools of thought, and there are allusions to people like Wisława Szymborska, a poet, to Timothy Snyder, the historian. There's a lot that's woven into it. So we had this massive document where we just exchanged all these ideas, and we used it later to isolate images, so bits that we felt lent themselves well to that we could transform into panels, to specific panels. And we ended up isolating around 100 panels in that first stage, and then we translated that into a treatment. So that was a big wall of text, I think around 2,000 words, more or less. But that was far more, it was sort of better organized than the Bible document. So we're slowly removing the redundant ideas and just limiting our scope. And then the final stage was a scriptment, or like a script and treatment combined into, which is essentially what a lot like the template that you gave us to work with during our module, which was that was super helpful to have a formula, so a template, but we were working from a more, I guess, intuitive stance. So we're trying to figure it out as we went along, and we came up with something that was quite similar to the formal template, but maybe not as clean and elegant, but it was effectively a script. And in that, I would spend around 3 sentences to describe every panel, and then I would write down the captions, the dialogue, and so each panel would be clearly designated and clearly isolated, and that would be at the final stage of my contribution. But although later on we would, I guess, so my partner, she would be working on the panels from the first panel until the last. It was all chronological. But first we had to map it out very clearly and very comprehensively. And from then on, we moved on to the visualizing stage, and she would sketch it first on an iPad, and then she would use Procreate, the platform, to turn it into what you see on the screen. So there were multiple stages to it, and we tried to keep it as professional as we could, but it was exhausting because we had 2.5 months to do it. So I guess main advice would be to give yourself more time, because we were definitely it was a very intense process.
I read it. It looks as professional as it could be. Like it's like produced a short graphic novel. I mean, both of you, this is amazing stuff in just 2.5 months. That's pretty incredible. I have more questions, but I just want to open it to the audience as well, in case you have any question for Antoni about his process, about his work. Kwasu, yes.
First, thank you so much for joining us today, Antoni, and thanks for sharing your process and some interesting sort of logistical issues and debates that go into trying to produce a graphic novel on one's own or in collaboration with a comrade. We have been talking a lot about the genre and the form and what it can precipitate. I'm really curious whether or not you found it easier or harder to engage politics directly, either through image text narratives or not, or did you find that it didn't really matter either way? I'm just really curious, that illusion of a decidedly political, and obviously, with the buy-in and interest of political actors, whether or not that was more difficult or easier for you.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. The backbone of the story came very organically and it was a natural process in terms of coming up with the premise, because we knew very well what we wanted to prioritize, but at the same time, I think at some point we found ourselves quite overwhelmed with the sheer amount of information and ideas that we wanted to embed in this, because we wanted to create this sort of universal reality, universal world that speaks to multiple armed conflicts. So Bosnia was the key, influenced in Ukraine, but the Spanish Civil War and many other historic American nuclear program as well. And at some point, you do sort of have to pick your lane, and we turned it into a more fictional piece than we originally intended. So I think at some point, abandoning that this statement component of it was liberating, I would say, if that makes sense.
It really does, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Anyone else has any other questions? Yeah, Andy?
Antoni, sorry, I'm on the other side of the room, so I won't be visible. I'll just be a
I can move the
kind of sepulchral voice.
Yeah, I can't see the room now anyway, but I can hear you really well.
Thank you. It's really fascinating to hear about your collaborative project. Is this a world that you imagine you will return to for future projects? You've created this Bible, this vivid set of inner lives. Will you go on? You may have mentioned this, but I missed it.
I think we always treated this as a one-off piece, but this is a far shorter version to what we originally intended, because I think another thing that becomes very clear when working on a graphic novel is that you do end up calibrating your ambitions quite quickly, because we ended up coming up with scripting, I think, 120 panels originally, and that was just not manageable. That was not feasible at all. And the final product, the final graphic novella, has 80, I think. So you do end up learning how to be as efficient as you can, blending different panels, and efficiency is really important. But at the same time, there is a lot of material that went unused. So there is definitely plenty that there's loads of opportunity there to continue this. But I did always envision this as a one-off.
Right. Thank you. Thanks very much. Great stuff.
And I have a question, but if anyone else has any other question.
Yeah, sort of.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I'm Edward, and I was wondering, in terms of like the drawing side of things, like, was that a case where you finished the script and then your partner immediately started working on the drawings? Like, how long did they have for that? Or was it more of like a throughout the process thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. So we started with, I'll move on to the previous slide. The images the pictures that you see in the screens are real photographs from Bosnia. And then in the images in the inside this eye are also, there are some real photographs from Ukraine as well. So we always treated this as something akin to a collage, where we were drawing from real photographs and from images we found in films, but mainly real photographs. So we had a catalog of images that we started with as we were writing the Bible, as we were writing the treatment. So there was already a catalog of some compositional ideas were there from the start, and then as we were isolating specific panels, we would every time I would finish a part of that work, we would jump on a call and we would just spend an hour exchanging ideas about how to turn that into an image. And then so it divided into multiple stages, and we were taking it step by step as we're developing the final version of the script, trying to keep this to, I guess, maintain the integrity of some of the original content that we're trying to reference and cite. So it is effectively a collage, and I wasn't sketching anything. So in terms of my contributions, it mostly had to do with the script, and then the conversations we had immediately after reading through that script, and then step by step this would take shape. And Veronica's work is incredible, and I wish she you guys could hear this from her side as well, because the hours she put into this are it's quite terrifying, to be honest. But yeah, this is I guess the gist of how we went about that. If that's clear.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I suppose to wrap up before we leave, after doing all of this, after creating this with a partner, creating this short graphic novella, is there any advice you would want to give to someone who perhaps wants to start creating their own graphic novel? Any piece of advice, any suggestion?
Well, the calibrating expectations part is, I guess, quite relevant, but at the same time, I think it's good to start with big ambitions, and then there is it most likely you will end up altering it as you go, but that is a very valuable process, because I guess you never will end up with just like with any piece of writing, the final product will be a lot different to what you envision. So I guess do start with big ideas and then just see where it takes you. And do if you're working with an illustrator, then make sure it's someone that you trust and that you can spend, that you have that the creative dynamic that you have with them is balanced, and that you understand each other well, because this will end up being like 50% your DNA, 50% of their creative DNA, and so you do have to be very in tune with each other's vision for this, because it's such a collaborative process.
Yeah, and I think again, like your idea of starting with a Bible of the project, that's such an amazing idea, to put everything in common and also to test if that creative vision is shared, I suppose, just through that initial step. Well, Antoni, thank you so much for coming to us online. You've been so kind with your time. Thank you so much for sharing the work. This has been super inspiring for me, and I'm sure for everyone here. So can we give Antoni a big round of applause?
Thank you guys so much for having me, and these really, really good questions. And I don't know, Ines, if you want, I could send you the link to the whole thing.
Please, so we can share it as well with the attendants today. And we will keep waiting for what you produce next, because I'm sure there are gonna be more others to come. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.